Carlos was a broken man. Losing his little daughter, Alba, shattered him into pieces he didn't know how to put back together. The funeral was unbearable, but something inside him just couldn't let go. Something felt wrong. Overwhelmed by grief and a strange, gut-wrenching feeling, Carlos did something no one would ever imagine. He placed a hidden camera in his daughter's coffin. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind spun in endless circles of why and how. It was a torment he couldn't escape. But the next day, when he nervously reviewed the footage, what he saw made his blood run cold. His heart nearly stopped. The camera had captured something impossible. Alba was only 10 years old, a sweet, vibrant girl who lit up Carlos's world. Her death was sudden and made no sense. One summer afternoon, while playing in the park near their home in a small Spanish village, she was gone, just like that. The doctors called it an accident, but Carlos couldn't accept it. There were no answers, no closure. Something deep in his soul screamed that this wasn't the end of the story. At the wake, Carlos stood frozen, staring at Alba. She looked so peaceful in the coffin, too peaceful, like she was simply sleeping. He felt this strange, unshakable pull. It whispered to him that something was off, that her story wasn't over. After hours of torment and a whispered conversation with his sister Clara, Carlos made a decision so out of the ordinary it seemed unthinkable. He placed a small, hidden camera in Alba's coffin before the burial. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the only way he could hold on to her. That night, Carlos sat alone in his darkened room, eyes glued to the computer screen. The live feed from the camera showed nothing but pitch-black silence. Just the coffin, still and lifeless. Hours passed like centuries, with nothing to soothe his heart or mind. The next day, after the weight of the funeral, Carlos had almost forgotten about the camera. But then, out of nowhere, he remembered. Hesitantly, he turned on the footage. And then, he froze. What he saw left him breathless. On the screen, in the blackness of the coffin, something stirred. It wasn't just his imagination. A faint shadow moved. His pulse quickened as a sound echoed through the silence. A soft, steady sound. Breathing. Carlos leaned in closer, his face inches from the screen. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not possible." His hands began to shake and his heart pounded like a drum. The breathing wasn't just there, it was constant, real, alive. For a split second, he wanted to believe it was a camera glitch, some kind of technical malfunction. But deep down, he knew. It was her coffin, and there was something inside. Desperate, Carlos snatched his phone and called Clara. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Clara, you have to come over right now. It's Alba. There's something in the coffin. I can't explain it. You need to see this for yourself." Clara hesitated. She thought her brother might have been pushed too far by his grief, imagining things that weren't there. But there was something in his voice, raw, urgent, that made her drop everything and rush to his house. 15 minutes later, Clara was standing at Carlos's door. He opened it with wild, frantic eyes. His face was pale, his hands shaking. Without saying a word, he grabbed her arm and led her straight to the room where the computer sat, connected to the coffin camera. Clara stared at the screen. At first, she saw nothing but darkness, silent, empty blackness. She was just about to tell Carlos that it was all in his head when it happened. The sound echoed softly through the speakers. A low, steady breath. Faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakably human. Clara froze. Her hand shot up to her mouth as her eyes widened in disbelief. "It can't be," she whispered, barely audible. The siblings stood there, paralyzed, staring at the screen. Seconds felt like hours as their minds raced. What was this? How was it possible? They had buried Alba. They had seen her lifeless body. This wasn't just grief messing with their heads. The sound was real. Carlos couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his car keys and turned to Clara. "We're going to the cemetery. Right now." "Are you out of your mind?" Clara tried to stop him, but the sheer determination in Carlos's eyes made her stop arguing. She knew there was no changing his mind. The drive to the cemetery was tense and silent. Carlos gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Clara sat beside him, staring out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind. If what they had heard was real, then what did it mean? Was Alba alive? How? By the time they reached the cemetery, it was well past midnight. The air was cold and still, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of a dog. The place was eerily quiet, cloaked in an unsettling darkness. Carlos parked near Alba's grave. The headlights cut through the shadows, but they didn't bring any comfort. He stepped out of the car, holding a flashlight in one hand and a shovel in the other. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Carlos, this is insane," she whispered, but she followed him anyway. The siblings stood at Alba's grave, and Carlos didn't waste any time. He plunged the shovel into the ground, the sound of metal scraping against earth piercing the silence. Clara stood a few steps back, holding the flashlight with trembling hands. Each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last. The sound of digging echoed in the quiet night, each scrape sending chills down Clara's spine. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every second dragging on like an eternity. Carlos's breathing grew heavier as he dug faster, his desperation fueling him. Clara kept glancing around, the eerie silence making her feel like they were being watched. She wanted to stop him, to scream that this was madness, but the sound from the camera haunted her. The deeper Carlos dug, the closer they got to uncovering the truth. And yet, the closer they got, the more terrified they became. After what felt like an eternity, the siblings reached the coffin. Carlos stopped, gripping the shovel tightly, his chest heaving, not from the effort, but from the sheer terror and anticipation building inside him. He turned to Clara, who gave a shaky nod, her face pale with fear. With trembling hands, Carlos pried open the lid of the coffin. The sound of the hinges creaking seemed deafening in the silent night. What they saw inside made their hearts stop. Alba's body was there, just as they had last seen it. Her small figure lay still, her white dress perfectly arranged. But something was different. Her cheeks, once pale and lifeless, now had a faint pink hue. And then they noticed it, her chest. It was rising and falling ever so slightly. "She's breathing," Clara gasped, her voice breaking. Carlos reached out, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He gently touched Alba's face. It wasn't cold. It was warm. "She's alive," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening sound of her own heartbeat. Carlos's eyes filled with tears as he fought to steady himself. "We have to get her out of here. Now," he said, his voice cracking with a mix of urgency and disbelief. Working together, they carefully lifted Alba out of the coffin. Her body was limp, her eyes closed, but the signs of life were undeniable. Carlos cradled her in his arms, holding her like she was the most fragile thing in the world. Without wasting another second, they rushed to the car. The drive to the hospital felt like a surreal dream. Carlos kept looking at his daughter, whispering her name over and over, hoping she would respond. Clara, sitting beside him, frantically called the hospital. She struggled to explain what was happening, avoiding the full truth to keep from sounding insane. When they arrived, the medical staff hesitated at first. The story seemed too unbelievable, too impossible. But when they examined Alba, their skepticism vanished, replaced by shock. She was alive. Her heartbeat was faint but steady, her breathing shallow but consistent. It was as if she were balancing on the edge between life and death. Doctors rushed to admit Alba to the ICU, running tests and scans to figure out how this could have happened. Carlos and Clara were left waiting outside, pacing the halls, their minds spinning with questions. What brought her back? Was it a miracle? Or was something far more unimaginable happening? Over the next few days, Alba began to improve. Her heartbeat grew stronger, her body temperature normalized, and signs of consciousness started to show. Carlos never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, hoping his voice would guide her back. And then, one quiet afternoon, it happened. Alba's eyelids fluttered open. Her dark eyes, still dazed, scanned the room. When they landed on her father, a faint, tired smile appeared on her lips.
"Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Carlos broke down, tears streaming down his face as he hugged her tightly, his heart overwhelmed with relief and love. Clara stood nearby, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes as well. It was a moment they would never forget. But even as they celebrated her return, one question remained unanswered. How? Carlos couldn't stop the tears streaming down his face as he held Alba close. "You're back, my little girl. You're back," he whispered, his voice trembling with relief and love. At first, everything seemed like a miracle, but as Alba started to regain her strength, she began sharing strange and unsettling memories. Her words sent shivers down Carlos and Clara's spines.
"I was in a dark place," Alba said one evening, her voice soft but haunting. Her wide eyes stared at nothing, as if she were reliving the experience. There were voices whispering to me. They said I couldn't stay. They told me it wasn't my time. Carlos tried to brush off her words, telling himself it was just a bad dream, a leftover fragment from her near-death experience. But deep down, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that there was more to this than he wanted to admit. Weeks turned into months, and Alba seemed to recover fully. She was smiling again, playing, and filling the house with laughter. For a moment, Carlos thought the nightmare was over. But then, the strange things began. It started small, objects moving to places no one had touched, lights flickering without reason. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Alba began speaking to people no one else could see. She'd stop mid-sentence, her head tilted, as if listening to someone invisible. "Daddy," she said one night, pointing to the corner of her room. "They're watching us." Carlos's heart froze. He couldn't deny the truth anymore. Something was wrong. Desperate for answers, he turned to books, folklore, and online stories. He found chilling accounts of people who had returned from death, but brought back something, or someone, uninvited. Determined to protect his daughter, Carlos sought help. He reached out to Father Mateo, a local priest known for dealing with the supernatural. When Carlos shared the full story, Father Mateo's expression grew dark. "What you're describing isn't unheard of," Father Mateo explained. "When a soul crosses over and returns, it can sometimes attract entities. These beings are drawn to the living, using them as a doorway to our world." Carlos's stomach churned. "What can we do?" "We need to perform a cleansing ritual," Father Mateo said firmly. "It's the only way to ensure Alba is free from any attachment." The ritual was planned for the following week. Carlos and Clara prepared the house exactly as instructed, placing salt around the windows and doors, removing mirrors, and creating a circle of protection in the living room. When the night came, the tension in the house was suffocating. Father Mateo arrived, carrying candles, holy water, and a Bible. His calm demeanor did little to ease their nerves. Alba sat in the center of the room, surrounded by a thick circle of salt. She looked small and fragile, her wide eyes darting nervously. Father Mateo began the ritual, his deep voice echoing in Latin. The air grew colder with every prayer, and an eerie stillness settled over the room. Then, out of nowhere, Alba let out a piercing scream. Her body convulsed violently, her eyes rolling back. Carlos rushed to hold her, his heart pounding. "What's happening to her?" "Stay strong," Father Mateo commanded. "Do not let go of her." The shadows in the room began to shift, twisting and swirling unnaturally. Shapes formed on the walls, shapes that didn't belong to anything living. They danced and moved like a storm of darkness, growing stronger with each passing second. Father Mateo's voice grew louder, his prayers sharper and more commanding. He flung holy water over Alba, and the shadows recoiled, hissing like snakes. Suddenly, Alba let out one final blood-curdling scream. Her body arched, and then, just as quickly, she went limp in Carlos's arms. The shadows vanished. The air felt lighter, almost normal again. Carlos held his breath, his hands trembling as he looked down at his daughter. Slowly, Alba's eyes fluttered open. She blinked, her gaze locking on him. "Daddy," she whispered weakly. "It's gone. I'm okay now." Carlos pulled her close,
tears pouring down his face. "You're safe now, my love. You're safe." Clara stood nearby, her hands covering her face, crying silently. The ordeal had left them shaken to their core, but Alba was back, truly back this time. From that night on, the strange occurrences stopped. The house felt normal again, and life slowly returned to what it had been. But Carlos would never forget that night. The night he learned the truth. The line between life and death is thinner than anyone could ever imagine.